Hello, everyone. Today we will be giving our last session of our symposium, and we will be hosting 3 distinguished academics. Actually, I'm feeling so privileged actually to host them in this session, to moderate their session. So in this session, as you might remember from the first one, our main aim is actually to cover all 3 different populations of Turkish child labor. So we will be talking about the Turkish children, Roma children, and also the Syrian refugee children. And all our speakers are really experts in their areas, and they will be specifically talking about these different ethnic groups and the problems we face in terms of fighting child labor in specific population groups. So in terms of the planning of the session, I can say we will first start with our presentations, and I will be leaving all the questions at the end. So hopefully when our speakers finish their presentations on time, and they have a maximum 20 minutes, so this is a reminder for them as well. So we will have enough time left after the presentation. So please feel free to ask your questions. I'll keep them and forward them to our speakers. So I would love to start with our first speaker, Professor Meltem Dayıoğlu Tarfur. She is a professor in the Department of Economics at Middle East Technical University. She received her PhD from the same university in 1995 and has been a faculty member since then. I think I can say that she's a role model for many young economists, including me. She has extensive work on labor economics, income distribution and poverty, migration, child labor, and gender issues. She has produced lots of papers, reports on child labor, and served as an advisor in a number of national and international projects on child labor. So we are so lucky to have her today in the session, where she will be summarizing actually what happened for the last 3 decades in Turkey in terms of fight against child labor in Turkey. So she will be talking about achievements and continuing challenges. And I'm already so excited about what she will present us today. So Hocam, floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Ayşegül, for your very kind words. So I won't spend any, I won't waste my time. So let me just try to share my screen with you for a minute. So my talk today is entitled 3 Decades of Fight Against Child Labor in Turkey, Achievements and Continuing Challenges. So basically, I'll be talking about what has happened to child labor over time in Turkey and why have we seen some of the changes that we have. So let me start with the numbers. So there are basically 5 child labor surveys that are done by the Turkish Statistical Institute, Turkstat. The first one was in 1994. And when we look at 1994, we see that about 15.3% of 6 to 17-year-olds were in employment. And that constituted about 2.5 million children in Turkey. And if you look at the age distribution, you would see that the very young children, who were like 6 to 14-year-olds, they made up like 40% of this group. Now, over time, well, the next survey, the second survey, was done in 1999. And there we actually estimated the number to be down from 2.5 million to 1.6 million. And that would correspond to about 10.2% of children. And then in 2006, that was the third survey that was done by the Turkish Statistical Institute. The employment rate went down further to 5.9%. So in these, from 1994 to 2006, we've observed a substantial improvement. And then the fourth survey came in 2012. There we still see the same figure as we have done in 2006. So it was about 5.9%. And then finally, our last data come from 2019 survey. And there we have seen that the employment rate went further down to 4.8%. And we've also seen a change in the composition of children who work, the very young group, the 6 to 14-year-olds, making about 1/5 of the total employed children. So let me show you a picture. So sometimes it's easier to understand what's going on with the picture. So as you can see, for the years from 1994 to 2006, the 12 years, we've seen this dramatic fall in the number of in the proportion of employed children. And in the next 13 years, from 2006 to 2019, you can see that there is some improvement as well, but not as dramatic as we have seen in the earlier period. And you see the improvement both in terms of the boys and the girls. So the blue is for all, but the orange line is for boys, and then the gray one at the bottom is for girls. And on the right-hand side, I distinguish between younger and older children. So the blue one is again for the total, and the top line is for 15 to 17-year-olds. And as you can see, even for the older age group, you see that improvement. And so the improvement is not only limited to the younger age cohort, but also the younger children, but also for the older children as well. And at the same time, we've seen a substantial improvement in school participation. So here I'm showing you what has happened to school enrollment of children, again, boys and girls, and for the total on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you see school enrollment for different age groups. Again, two age groups have distinguished between 6 to 14-year-olds and 15 to 17-year-olds. As you can see, there has been substantial improvement in school enrollment as well. So the question I'm asking is, what are the drivers of change? We've seen these very substantial improvements, both in terms of the employment of children and enrollment in school, and also, in fact, graduation from school. I did not show you that, but most of these kids who were in school actually graduated. So what are the drivers of change? What have we done that caused such a dramatic change in a relatively short period of time, in the last 30 years? So many of you probably know that Turkey joined the IPEC program, that was the ILO's international program on the elimination of child labor, in 1992. So starting from that day and onwards, so starting from the early 1990s onwards, Turkey has shown a great emphasis on the fight against child labor. So from 1992 to 2006, over 100 small-scale local projects have been carried out within the framework of the IPEC program. Unfortunately, most of these programs were not designed in a way that will allow us to systematically evaluate them. So we don't know how effective they were. I'm sure that they have improved the livelihoods of children, but most of them, I should tell you that most of them were very small scale and very localized projects, not across Turkey or anything like that. The second explanation might be something to do with, obviously, household income and poverty. We have shown for Turkey, but also repeatedly for many countries around the world, that poverty is an important determinant of child labor. So as household income increases, obviously we would expect an improvement over time. So this we already expect, right? If things are going well for the country, this will reflect upon poorer households. They will realize higher income, and therefore we would also see an improvement in child schooling and employment. Another important development that happened over these 30 years was a change in the legal working age in Turkey. So in 1998, Turkey ratified the minimum age convention of the ILO and set age 15 as the minimum age of employment. And this was reflected in the labor law that was drawn in 2003. But as many of you probably know, in parallel to this convention, there are many exemptions that exist in the law. And in fact, we also know that the majority of children work in the informal sector anyway. So I don't think that this was a binding concern anyway, but I mean, that's still an important improvement. And finally, I will in fact argue that in the rest of in my speech, that in fact, the most important development that happened over these 30 years that I think is, in fact, the main driver of this improvement in schooling and concurrently the drop in employment is to do with the school reforms. The most important school reform that we had was the 1997 school reform that increased compulsory schooling from 5 to 8 years. And there we have done a number of papers looking at what was the effect of this reform on many aspects of children's lives, including early marriages, adolescent fertility, but also on child labor. And we, in fact, see substantial improvements in school enrollment and graduation, particularly for the rural children, and in fact, most importantly, for rural girls. Rural girls, as you would know, were in fact the most disadvantaged group among all these different groups of children. And in fact, another very important feature of the 1997 reform was that although it was not designed, obviously, as a tool to fight against child labor, and we will see that in fact it did work that way, it targeted mainly middle school, right? I mean, the law was that previously would finish primary school, but then the 1997 reform said, no, now compulsory schooling includes middle school. But then not only do we see an improvement in participation in middle school, but also in high school. High school was out of scope actually for the law. Nonetheless, we see spillover effects onto high school. So in the recent paper that we have completed, we see that the reform reduced child labor by about 28% among 12 to 17-year-olds and about 81% among the very young 7 to 11-year-olds. Okay. Now, the numbers that I have given you so far on employment and work, I actually mean economic work, the way that International Labor Organization measures employment and work. But of course, what is important also for girls is domestic activities that happen at home. We call them household chores. And in fact, we also look at household chores and what happens to household chores. And you actually see that the probability of spending long hours doing work within the household also reduces. So we see lots of very important effects coming from the 1997 reform. But that's not the only reform that we have observed. In fact, in 2012, we have this another school reform that this time increased compulsory school education from 8 to 12 years, right? And so we are working on this reform now, but the early preliminary analysis we have done show an improvement in high school attendance as well. We don't see that dramatic reduction in child labor, and we ask ourselves why this is the case. There are some improvements, and there's another paper that also finds an improvement in non-agricultural wage employment among 15 to 18-year-olds. So this is, again, another potentially important policy tool that we have realized over the 30 years. So in understanding the drivers of change, there are a number of things that stand out. One of them, is, as I mentioned, is household income and what happened to it, the school reforms and how it changed the behavior of parents in terms of putting their child to work or sending them to school. So what I wanted to do was basically look at the association between child schooling and employment and the circumstances surrounding children. What I mean by circumstances is those things that children cannot change themselves, right? So for instance, household has education. You don't get to choose what kind of household you're born into, right? Whether your parents are educated or not. You don't get to choose where you live, the place of residence, urban versus rural, for instance, and obviously your gender. So what I've done, and what I will be showing you in a number of graphs, is basically look at how these circumstances, the importance of these circumstances in determining children's schooling and employment have changed over time, over these 30 years. And that's going to give us an important clues as to what has been happening. And I take households education basically as a proxy for household income, household's permanent income. So my assumption is that higher the household's education, the higher is the household income of the child. And again, the rural areas, I take it as that the household income in rural areas is lower on average as compared to urban areas. And I'm interested in gender to see how far girls and boys differ from each other. So here's a picture. I hope that you can see the colors. So what I'm showing you on the horizontal axis is basically the different years. So I'm basing, again, all my analysis on these 5 child labor force surveys. And I'm looking at how the enrollment probability of children have changed with household heads education. And I've divided the education into 5 categories. So I have household heads that do not have a primary school education. That's called the not completed. So they haven't completed any schooling level, well, primary education really. And then you have primary school, you have middle school, that will be lower secondary education, high school or upper secondary education, and then above upper secondary, something above high school, meaning that I should have written there, post-secondary education, really. And as you can see in 1994, your household income, so let me just read education as if I'm talking about household income. As you can see, children from lower income households, or if you wish, children coming from lower educated households were less likely to go to school as compared to children from households with where the household head has beyond high school education. In fact, it was 100% for those. Everybody went to school. If your household head had university education, surely you would also go to school. And as you can see, what I'm interested in looking at is what has happened to this relationship over time. And as you can see, it has weakened over time. So for the 7 to 14-year-olds, your household income no longer is a very important determinant or whether you go to school or not. Okay. Now, when we do the same analysis this time for 15 to 17-year-olds. Again, we ask the same question. If you're born to a household where income is low, right, or where the education of the household head is very low, what is your probability of enrolling in school? And as you can see, in 1994, this was quite low, right? So, and there was a big difference between children with household with different education of the household heads or with different household incomes. So there was a very distinct relationship here. And as you can see, this relationship has weakened over time. In 2019, right, it still matters. Your household income still matters. It determines whether you are in school or not, but that relationship has weakened, right? And therefore, we still say that, yes, for 15 to 17-year-olds, household income still matters, but less in comparison to what we had 30 years ago or 25 years ago, to be exact. Now, then also compare, what about urban and rural distinction? In 1994, the children from rural areas, or rural households, I should say, they had a lower probability of going to school. This has changed over time. As you can see, this orange bar has increased over time. And in fact, the difference between urban and rural areas has also reduced for the very young, the 7 to 14-year-olds. When you come to 15 to 17-year-olds, you still see that there's a difference between urban and rural areas, but then again, also the gap has closed quite a bit. Okay, and then I do the same thing for girls and boys, And you can see girls were disadvantaged in 1994. Their likelihood of going to school were 85% as compared to over 90% for boys. But then this gap, as you can see, closed as we have observed in 2019. And the same thing is observed for 15 to 17-year-olds. There was a gap between boys and girls 25 years ago, and this has also closed quite substantially. And now I turn to employment. How far do we observe a gap by the household head schooling? And again, this time we see an opposite relationship that we have seen for schooling, right? I mean, children who are most likely to work are those that come from households where the household head had less than primary schooling. That bar is close to 12%. And as you can see, this risk goes down with education, right? So education or income, as I read it, was an important determinant whether the child was put to work or not. As you can see, it has weakened over time. This relationship has weakened over time. And when we come to 2019, again, household income matters somewhat, but not as much as it did 25 years ago, right? You see this relationship becoming rather weak. And we also see the same thing for 15 to 17-year-olds. There was, look at this relationship in 1994, quite dramatic, right? And then it goes, this relationship weakens. Still, for the 15 to 17-year-olds, employed children mostly come from households where the household head has less schooling. But this relationship has also dramatically diminished in 2019.
Meltem hocam, sorry to interrupt. Just 1 minute left.
1 minute left? That's, yes. Wow. Okay, so I try to speed up. Okay, and then we see the same thing for urban and rural areas. The relationship has weakened. We still see rural areas, working children coming from rural areas mostly. And for boys and girls, this time boys are at a higher risk of employment. It has also reduced for both of these groups, but nonetheless, the relationship is still there. So to sum up, we see very substantial improvements over time. This is very important, and we ask ourselves, what have we done right to bring down these rates so fast over these past 30 years? And I would argue that among all the different explanations we can offer, in fact, one of the most important explanations is to do with this investment in schooling that was done by the government. The 1997 reform was particularly very important, and the reason why it ended up changing the behavior of households because it reduced the cost of schooling. Because the 1997 reform was not just the law. You would pass the law and nobody abides by the law. But here we actually see a change in the behavior. And when you ask yourself, why was the change in behavior? Not because the government said that now compulsory schooling has increased. No. In fact, they passed the law, they changed the law, they made it, they increased the years of compulsory schooling, but at the same time, there was a huge amount of investment. What kind of investment? Well, in fact, you would, especially in rural areas, we have seen busing. Busing was extensively done. We've seen an increase in boarding schools. We've seen establishment of new schools. So there was a lot of money spent, huge amount of investment in schooling that reduced the cost of schooling and therefore encouraged parents to send their children to school and to take them away from work. For 15 to 17-year-olds, we don't see that. I mean, we see dramatic improvements as well, but we still see room for improvement. And part of the reason is because they've also experienced, obviously, reduction in cost. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there's a higher opportunity cost for older children, obviously, that the chances of finding wage work is higher, and therefore, and also, of course, their productivity is higher, and therefore the wages they would command is higher. So we still have room for improvement for 15 to 17-year-olds. But happily to report, then gender gap in schooling is pretty much closed for Turkey. What are the new challenges? Well, new challenges are migrant children. The anecdotal evidence shows Syrian children working in irregular establishments. We see them in street work. So this is a new challenge for us that we need to be thinking about. And we don't have that much data on migrant children, and we need to investigate it more carefully. Old and continuing challenges, seasonal work, particularly in agriculture, that is still an important problem. The data that I've shown you pertains to the last quarter of each year that the survey was done. So it doesn't properly capture the seasonal work aspect of it, right? But still, nonetheless, the fact that we've seen this dramatic improvement in schooling is very encouraging and tells us that, in fact, Turkey can be an exemplary country for other countries in thinking about what tools they can put together in the combat against child labor. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to present my work.
Thank you for this really great presentation. I'm sure everyone learned a lot for the last 30 years what has happened in Turkey. And for the Turkish children's case, we also learned from your presentation that investments in education and investments in reduction of poverty in general is really crucial to fight against child labor. But still, when we look at specific population groups, including Roma population in Turkey and Syrians, we don't see this improvement in child labor. And even for the main channels that you describe, education and poverty, we see that, for example, for Roma population, there's a persistence in poverty, which is reflected on continuation of child labor through generations. And now I would love to turn to our second speaker, Başak Akkan, Professor Başak Akkan. And we are lucky to have her here because she's one of the, I think, few experts in that area for Roma children. And we will be learning a lot from her presentation, I am sure. So let me first briefly introduce her to you. Dr. Başak Akkan is a senior research fellow at the Social Policy Research Center and a lecturer at the graduate program in social policy at Boğaziçi University. She holds a PhD in interdisciplinary social science from Utrecht University, Netherlands. Her main research areas are in the theories of welfare state, justice, intersectionality, focusing on care policies, childhood, child well-being, and life course perspective on social policies. She has various journal publications, so I strongly suggest you to read her extensive work on children, child well-being. And today she will be giving us a presentation about Roma children and talking particularly about the well-being perspective. So floor is yours, Dr. Akkan. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, let me make it. Hold on, please. Okay. Again, thanks a lot for inviting me to this webinar conference. And it was really exciting to listen to Meltem Hoca. I have been following her work very closely. And I will move to a little bit messy world of qualitative work from her after her neat charts. What I'll try to do today is address child labor with a particular focus on Roma children, and I'll try to do it from a child well-being perspective. Since the 2000s, actually, there had been extensive work done on conditions of Roma. We do have some, empirical, substantial empirical research on Roma and Roma children in Turkey, but also around the world, in Europe as well. So, one asks, can we say something new about Roma children? We know the conditions, we know, the difficulties that Roma children face. But what I'll try to do today, attempt to do, is to look at this issue from a holistic perspective, child well-being perspective, which also I think pushes us to think more holistic social policies that targets child labor. So I will spend some time on child well-being as an analytical framework in a nutshell, actually, to give you the view. But when we talk about Roma children, we of course talk about child poverty, but not just child poverty. Child poverty that drives from low socioeconomic status or income poverty. We are talking about an intersectional inequality where ethnic identity, as well as gender, sometimes disability, and special segregation, all these issues intertwine with low socioeconomic status and lead to the persistent, durable inequalities. So child labor actually is an outcome of this historically constructed inequality, intersectional inequality process. So we could refer to it multifaceted inequality. So what does the framework entail? What does child well-being framework entail for Roma children? Then I will move to that issue, and I will finish with social policies that targets that. So when we address child well-being, many of you know it draws on Amartya Sen's capability framework that we need to focus on life choices, the constrained circumstances of people that goes beyond resources and the means that a person has. So in that respect, we go beyond survival, the responding the basic needs, but we deal with quality of life and capabilities, what these entail and what these have implications for children. Because what we see is that children mostly mediate both resources and risk factors in their life, and they construct their well-being. So when we look into the features of well-being, we see that children are, this is a very, established approach that the children are the agents of their well-being. So they are experts of their lives, they are agents of their well-being. So we need to both take into consideration the risk factors, like the negative outcomes, like child labor is one of them that we are talking today, but also protective factors, positive outcomes. So this is a process-oriented research, how children make use of these resources, but also within a network of within their social networks, within their families, communities, and larger society. Particularly for Roma children, the larger society is a big question when it comes to also participation issues. So along with this, child well-being research not just deals with the becoming, not just future prospects, becoming an adult, but immediacy, childhood status of the children. So in that respect, life chances of children are always discussed in relation to their immediate childhood status in these different spheres of social relations. And also child well-being perspective opens us the space to come up with policy-oriented research, because at the end of the day, when you come up with these different indicators, that they will be useful for the policymakers and activists, community workers, to monitor the child well-being at these different levels in different contexts. So we could talk about these different domains that pertains to child well-being. When we do child well-being research, material well-being, of course, the income level of the family, health, education, participation to a larger society, housing and environment, risk and safety, but also it's a relational process. So you look into children's relationship and subjective well-being, how they perceive these processes, how they perceive themselves in these processes. So it's a relational process. So when we look into Roma children, Roma children's multifaceted vulnerabilities, which are the causes of child labor and other negative outcomes along with child labor, we could address some difficulties that pertain to these different domains that of children's lives. Education is an important domain, as empirical research vividly demonstrates. The Roma children are having difficulties in access to education. Housing and environment conditions are very important for understanding these specific vulnerabilities, because we are talking about the segregated Roma neighborhood, inadequate accommodation conditions, and of course material well-being of Roma families, insecure livelihood, uncertain income, precarious jobs. These are also important aspects of this multifaceted vulnerabilities, and COVID-19 has shown it very openly, actually. When the material well-being of Roma families deteriorate, it leads to child labor. So from these vulnerabilities that we talk about, these negative outcomes for Roma children, school dropouts are high among Roma children. Again, inadequate environment for their capability development, childhood deprivation and poverty that we have, that empirical research also has demonstrated, and child labor as a support mechanism for the family. Okay, let me talk about briefly what qualitative research has demonstrated in relation to these areas. Of course, I will refer to our research, but like as I said, since the 2000s, there's this extensive research done, and the reports carried out by the international organizations, NGOs that address these issues openly. So we know these already, but let me talk about some of them. Like we see that the dropouts, accounts of dropouts of Roma children are mostly due to the economic reasons, burden of financial costs. So there is the stereotyping of Roma families, like they do not value education. But our research reveals the opposite. So this financial burden of schools is a major factor. So again, we see that getting into work at a young age to contribute family budget is one of the major reasons for dropouts. So child labor is a survival strategy for Roma families, particularly in times of crisis. Again, COVID-19 has demonstrated it very openly. Apart from access to education, the exclusionary processes, discrimination in the education system is also another reason for for weakening of the ties with education for Roma children. But as important as that, again, we need to look into this bigger picture of educational inequalities in Turkey, because what we see is that Roma children do have, the Roma children who have access to education do have access to these schools in their segregated neighborhoods with inadequate physical conditions, with lack of resources. So education does not emerge as a social space for them to realize their capabilities. So it reproduces the inequalities. It functions as a stratification mechanism for Roma children. So also it's part of this disengagement, disbelief in the educational processes. And along with this, as many research has demonstrated, the housing conditions and the neighborhood conditions do affect the education performance of Roma children. Again, COVID-19 has also demonstrated that. Also, in relation to the material well-being of families, this insecure livelihood, we know that social assistance schemes are vital in the livelihood strategies of not just Roma families, all disadvantaged families who live on this uncertain income. So again, the inadequacy of social assistance schemes fail to provide uncertainty for Roma families. Also, they create vulnerabilities in the access process because of also the stigma around Roma people, stereotyping, who are trying to abuse the system. All these come together and create another vulnerability in that process. So let me talk a little bit about COVID-19 pandemic, because there is kind of evidence that it contributed to the increase of child labor in the Roma community. So what we witness from the field, particularly that come from grassroots NGOs or researchers working. This needs further research. I think we need to continue to research. But first, witnesses, we see that Roma children are forced into work to the loss of jobs of their families or sicknesses in the families due to the COVID-19. And also the income of the adults, the inadequate income also get worse due to the COVID-19, as we all know. It's not enough to sustain the family. So what we see is that a deteriorating condition, like in some families, only children work. The economic financial burden for the care of the families has been increasing. And also we could talk about the care burden of the girls who are engaged in the care of their siblings and other dependents of the families. And we see that social assistance schemes are not working. And it came to a point that almost no access to social assistance. Roma children's access to education also is a major issue due to their conditions, household conditions, these digital inequalities, technological gaps, the usage of these technological utilities. So, this has been discussed and demonstrated widely. So these all actually point to future difficulties, further increase in child labor, and losing ties with education that needs to be monitored very closely when we both by academics, activists, but also policy makers. So the gaps are widening with other children when we talk about Roma children. So social policies, how to tackle child labor. Of course, we can address a wide range of social policies. We need to address them. But two, I think, are two areas are I think they need priority and urgency in a way. One is supporting the families, these regular social assistance to families. Basic income, as you may have followed, has been discussed extensively around the world as a response to the economic shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has been implemented in Spain and Finland. So I think we should give a chance. I think we should definitely give a priority to these kind of policy approaches in order to support the families. And secondly, school's importance not for Roma children, of course, for all children. For my son, who's 12 years old, we all understood its immense importance, not as a space for education, but a space for socialization, and it has several meanings for children, and it has a very important space domain for child well-being. So as child well-being researchers, we always try to approach school not as just an education space, but also can we imagine school as a social welfare space? So what we mean by that, can school be imagined as a place where the basic needs of these vulnerable children could also be met? Like, for instance, the food poverty that will, again, it has been discussed extensively that COVID-19 will lead to severe forms of food poverty in Turkey among these vulnerable groups, like through school lunches, breakfast programs. Can we also, sustain these children when, hopefully, when the this pandemic is over? Also, for Roma children, can it be considered as a study space? Of course, it's important to improve the housing conditions, but it is not easy to improve it in the short run. So I think giving priority to these different institutions where children could be supported in these spaces are also important. So school could also be used as a space for to support these children, and of course prioritizing
Hocam, so sorry to interrupt. Just can you sum up in 1 minute, please?
Okay,
I'm
just
sorry.
no problem. I'm finishing. Just the last words, and also prioritizing vulnerable children to overcome the learning loss. As I also said, this educational inequalities in Turkey has a special character. So we know that in these schools with inadequate resources are situated in these deprived neighborhoods. This is the bigger picture, bigger educational inequalities in Turkey. So the policymakers could target these schools in deprived neighborhoods as a priority to tackle the gaps in the educational gains that could lead to the even worst forms of child labor, or so these durable inequalities, intersectional inequalities. I think I can stop here. Thank you.
Wow, it was already the last slide. Okay, thank you so much. This was really a great presentation, I believe, and it showed for everyone, for the audience, I think, the situation of Roma children's well-being, and particularly you informed us about how COVID-19 might have an effect on them. So it was very important. And I think what you said in your last words were quite important to underline. So we should be supporting both families and also in terms of education, the schools should be supported as well, because in Turkey we have address-based education system. So Roma children are attending the schools in their neighborhood, and unfortunately the budget available for each school is very low already, and we know that parents are supporting schools in most of the cases, and for the Roma children this is not possible because Roma families are living under poverty as well. So this is also, this and all other actually points you raised come up in front of us in our research in Kuştepe for this project, and it seems that coming from that, it seems that Syrian children have lots of shared disadvantages, unfortunately, and in many cases it's not easy to understand which is more advantages in terms of well-being. Unfortunately, even as a local population, we see Roma children is more marginalized and disadvantaged, and in some cases we might even see Syrian children's situation is even better compared to Roma children's situation. So moving from that, and maybe before I should also again on the education issue, you talk about food poverty. Maybe I should announce a project of Istanbul Technical University. We will be recently, hopefully, having a pilot project with Roma schools, and we will be providing foods, actually breakfast for Roma children, because this is also what we had realized in the field. This was an important disadvantage of Roma children, affected their attendance, their concentration on their courses, and many other things. So hopefully soon we will announce this project. It will be in Istanbul, so we hope to contribute to this issue. So moving from there, now we will be talking about the case of Syrian refugee children. We have our third distinguished speaker, Associate Professor Zeynep Şahin Mectek. She is an associate researcher at the moment at Bonn International Center for Conversion, and awarded Humboldt Research Fellowship, a very prestigious fellowship for experienced researchers. She is also Senior Research Fellow at Canadian Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration. Previously, she held an international fellowship at the Center for Global Cooperation Research in Duisburg, and still have an associate senior fellow position there. She was a senior researcher in many projects, but recently maybe you heard of the Horizon 2020 project called Respond, multi-level governance of mass migration in Europe and beyond. Her research is examining actually various aspects of migration, governance of migration, foreign policy migration nexus, comparative politics and politics in the Middle East, and diaspora politics. She has a recent book published in Routledge with the title Refugee Governance, State, Politics in Middle East. I strongly suggest you to read that book, because in that book you'll see that she's exploring how refugee governance actually is differing across countries and why they diverge. And particularly she is looking at Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And as you know, these three countries are currently the world's top refugee hosting countries. So I'm already excited to hear her presentation. She will be today talking about vulnerabilities, challenges, and coordination failures for the case of refugee children in Turkey. So Zeynep Hocam, floor is yours. You have also 20 minutes.
Thank you, Ayşegül, for this great and a little exaggerated introduction. I am very happy to be here with you, and also I'm extremely glad that the Professor Başak Akkan and Meltem Dayıoğlu have already set the ground and mentioned about the very important the terms in addressing to the child issues in Turkey, from children well-being to these intersectional inequalities and the relationship between the schooling policies and the child labor, struggle against the child labor. Here I will talk about a little about the child and migration in general, and specifically looking at the forced migration. And then I will just introduce very shortly what about the national framework about child refugees in Turkey. And then I will move to the protection challenges by drawing my field work in 2018 and 2019. I think it will be a little also the complementary what Ayşegül presented in the morning, because my field work were in Izmir and Şanlıurfa, as well as at the Gaziantep in 2019, and it was supported by the Respond project, Horizon 2020 project, and also I am drawing some interviews of my colleague Ela Gökalp Aras, whom we worked together for a long time, and we wrote the many reports about the refugee issues in Turkey. And I will start with the identification of the unaccompanied minors, and then move to the sheltering and age assessment issues and education and health. Then talked a little about the early marriages and violence, and then move to the child labor. And as I'm a researcher in governance and the policy making fields, I will talk about the coordination issues, which is in a big problem, kind of in a problem in the field, and then I will conclude to the presentation. Let me just start with the very general, the things about the children and migration. We know that the children are migrating. They are migrating with their families. Sometimes they are migrating by themselves, specifically the older children, like, from 13, 14 years to the 18 years old, they are migrating alone. And also they are the part of the migration experience because those stay in the countries of origins after their parents' migration, right? And according to the UNHCR's figures, almost half of the refugee population in the world are made up by children. And this is a huge number considering the refugee children, and just assume that Turkey as the main hosting country of the Syrian refugees is right now hosting 2.6 million Syrians plus 500,000 non-Syrian asylum seekers, mainly from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and many African countries. And we know that specifically the forced migration is presenting dangers to the safety of the physical safety of the children and the well-being of the migrating children rather than the average child encounter. And this includes the risk of abuse, risk of neglect, violence, exploitation by family members or exploitation by the smugglers, trafficking, right? And also in some very extreme cases, like we are observing in the many African countries, of the military recruitment of the children by the armed groups. So the forced migration is not an easy experience for children and for children's well-being during their childhood period and longer term. And what about the national framework about it, right? We know that Turkey is recently designed, and recently in 2014, designed its law on foreigners and international protection. And this is the main framework, which is the regulating the Turkey's treatment of the foreigners and those looking for international protection, and also those under temporary protection. As you know, the Syrians are under the temporary protection, right? And this law specifies, gives us an idea, as it is, the specifying the persons with special needs. Under this category, Turkish law is recognizing the unaccompanied minors are those needs special need. And also the same law defines who are the unaccompanied minors. Although it doesn't give any specific idea about the age, but it says that a child who arrives in Turkey without being accompanied by an adult, or even if they enter the Turkey with an adult, but then left alone, these are, these group of children are called unaccompanied minor or unaccompanied children. And as the Professor Dayıoğlu talked about, the Turkey is reflected to the the international law in its national law, as we see in the IOLA's legislation, the same has happened to the, the UN Convention on Child Rights. Turkey reflected it in its law, national law, and also the refugee law. And according to that, Turkey is, responsible to seek for the best interest of the children. And the Ministry of the Family is the responsible authority to provide a shelter to the unaccompanied children. And if the children is over 16, they can be, placed to the reception and accommodation centers along with the adults. And also the siblings shall be accommodated together to the extent possible. But as this is in the law, as we know that not often the case that the law and the implementation is the reflecting to the same. But at least Turkey has a very strong law and a reformed law about the needs of the refugee children, at least at the protection level. However, in the implementation, we see problems. Here, I don't want to just look at the Syrian refugees, but also looking at the other refugee and the migrant groups in Turkey. As you know, Turkey is also in a transit country, right? And many, the Afghan and Iraqi and the Pakistani refugees are using Turkey as a transit to enter to Europe. And we know that the problems about the children protection in Turkey, immigrant children protection in Turkey, starts at the borders during entries and exits. And we know these, the pictures. I didn't want to put them here, but our interviews in the field says that, for instance, if I quote this interview of my colleague Ela Gökalp Aras, the one security officer in Izmir told us that the ones that we quote are mainly children. The number of the ones who are under 18 is pretty high. If there are 50 migrants, 15 or 20 of them are children, the older children. Although we don't have an exact statistics about the numbers, but we know that the substantial amount of the refugees who are using Turkey as a transit country are made up by children. And for this concern, there is a need to identify them, right? If they are caught by the security officers when they are trying to cross the agency, you need to identify them in order to provide a sheltering to them, right? And but the data is a huge problem in Turkey, like in other fields, and we don't have an exact data about how many unaccompanied children are Syrians or how many unaccompanied children are non-Syrians, and nobody knows, according to the officer. Once the number was declared as 50,000 for Syrians as the unaccompanied one, but identification of them is not possible now, unlike before. The reason is that in the 2018, Turkey transferred to the refugee status determination from UNHCR to Turkish authorities, and there was a kind of a transition period in which we have a limited data about the unaccompanied children. And this has some implications and exploitations of these migrants on the move by the smugglers. We have many, the anecdotes about it, but you can find them in the report. We don't have that much time to go. But it is clear that specifically these old migrant groups are really under risk of the exploitations by the smugglers from putting them into the houses or beaten or threatening by force. And the challenge for the officers is that how the age assessments will be done, because age assessment is a kind of criteria in order to accept a child as a child or an adult, and this is also implications for sheltering. If the children is found below 18, it will be sheltered, right? And also the INGOs doesn't have a role there. They're only responsible to inform the Minister of Family and the Social Policies about these unaccompanied minors. And this is their responsibility. if the family, Minister of Family cannot find any shelter, and then INGOs like Assam or UNHCR can take in a role. For instance, also some other state institutions like Diyanet is trying to, to find its own ways to give a shelter to the unaccompanied kids. But the age assessments, we see very problems in the field about the age assessments because it requires bone tests and often children who are in the very critical, like 17 and 16 years of, they are tend to be recorded as an 18 to avoid extra procedural barriers. Not only the unaccompanied children, but let's think that the majority of the children living in urban and the rural areas, and we've seen in the important challenges in education and the health sector. Although the schooling is free, and compared to the Jordan and the Lebanon, in which I did a field research before, and access to the education and access to the health is quite good. In Turkey, we should say that. And also among our interviews in different parts of the, different parts of the Turkey, often the Syrians told us that they are very happy about the health. And they are also very happy to the free access to the education. We should acknowledge that. But still there are some problems. The problems are seems related to lack of the registration. If a Syrian family doesn't have any registration or ID, it is a kind of, the barrier to access to the school. And there are problems in diploma or degree recognition, specifically for kids who are in the high school or university. And we see also the lost years in the first years of the, their migration to year. Language barriers is a problem not only for the children, but also for the families to help them. And also we see specifically in the Şanlıurfa field is that disabilities, because this city has a large number of disabled Syrians, as it is a border city, because the families are not able to migrate onward, and many disabled families with disabled children live there. And disabilities is a problem to access to schools also. I observed IOM is making some projects, but it's not that enough. And the poverty, you mentioned about it a lot, and is also a barrier for education. And the bullying and discrimination, it seems, a kind of a problem in the last years, specifically worsened by the hate crimes. And access to health is an issue. As I said, it is quite good compared to other contexts, but still the lack of registration and IDs, and also disabilities, specifically access to the rehabilitation services. And I was told by the, the NGO workers that the mentally disabled Syrian children has a big problem to access to the rehabilitation services, unlike to the Turkish children. And also difficulties in accessing to the medical equipment and the operations if the children are disabled or wounded because of the war. And we see also the challenges in the protection from violence, because this, as Professor Başak Akkan said, this is very multifaceted vulnerabilities. We see that, these problems include exploitation, neglected kids, criminalized kids, or traumatic cases. This is what an NGO worker told me. Also, the early marriages seems an issue. We have this general tendency to say that, early marriage among Syrians is a very cultural or religious-oriented thing. Actually, no. It seems that the early marriages in the Syrian community seems in a kind of unfortunate protection mechanism. It's a protection mechanism, and also in two ways. One day to to avoid any rumor or in a kind of being in a new environment and the protection, but at the same time is in a kind of an economic opportunity, because the families are thinking in that if they the children work with a Turkish citizen husband, it will be also economically benefiting them. But this is bringing the too many exploitations and the problems, right? And also the big issue is that as I heard from the IOM representatives, for instance, they are saying that the big problems is that these specifically very young girls who, when they got married, they are struggling with their own childhood and the mothering simultaneously. Because they are around, the 14 or 16 years old. This is a huge problem. And also we see that gender-based violence is also the case, not only for the Turkish community, but also all the marginalized communities and the Syrians. And in terms of the policy approaches, we know that for Turkish citizens also is difficult, but for Syrians it is much harder to access to protection if Syrian women encountered any violence, domestic violence. And because the cases of violence are not taken in short time periods, even if the families, let's say, consult with the police or judiciary, but the cases is taking a long time, and in the meanwhile they are losing their trust to the system, and the gender-based violence seems a problem. And all of you are very expert on the child labor. Maybe I cannot say that much, but just some insights from the field, specifically from the Şanlıurfa, because the city is famous to be the having a large number of the child labor traditional for a long time, including to the seasonal agricultural workers. Also, I did an interviews in the rural areas of the city and the seasonal, agricultural places, and it seems that child labor was there, but it was exacerbated with the Syrian refugee migration, and specifically in the agricultural areas. But it's not just limited to the agricultural areas, because you see the refugee children are working in everywhere, wherever they find their work. The textile shops, service sector, industry, in-house jobs, and also it's similar in Izmir. But I found, the more child labor issue in Şanlıurfa. And as Professor Dayaoğlu said, we don't have that much data specifically about the Syrian child labor, but the estimates are around 15 or 25% of the refugee children are working. And the ages of them are ranging from very young ages, like 10 to 17. And the field, as many of them, almost all of them, not many, almost all of them are working in the informal sector. It is up to the very high level exploitation, including paid very limitedly, while the numbers are around 50 Turkish liras weekly in Izmir. It is about the 5 or 10 or 20 TL in Urfa. And delays in payments, wage theft, poor working conditions, lack of physical security, lack of security in the case of the sicknesses. For instance, in at least 2-3 families I encountered with the Syrian family, their young son was experienced in a working accident. And they are just at home, given a little money from their employer, that's all. And no social security, also I want to underline that when we look at the hate crimes, in the last years, they are targeting working young refugee men. We see the kind of, this gender aspect here. What about the governance of this? We should acknowledge that this is a very, let's say, the hard fields, because you will tackle with being a refugee and poverty, child labor, protection issues, right? These requires a lot of coordination. And also the coordination of the state actors as well as non-state actors, both international NGOs and national NGOs, right? We see that specifically in the field of the refugee children, ministries, Turkish ministries are emphasizing on the education and the child labor a lot compared to the other protection challenges. Also, UNHCR has its own working groups about the child protection, and also IOM has its own programs. But what I am, what I observed is a little kind of a coordination problem between them, among these actors. And also, as you said, the projects are very, very short term. They're like 8 months, 10 months, but and an NGO is entering to the field, and then for 8 months, and then they are saying, "Oh, bye bye, we are going." And this is, these short-term projects is not, and also there's no performance evaluations afterwards. These are kind of, the issue which is on the long run. Okay, benefiting. I'm sure that they are benefiting some, the refugees, but they are not adequate to address the problems. And INGOs taking a huge role, but mainly the subsidiarity role. We should say that, the ministries have a large saying, or the central authority over the field. And as there are some quotations from my interviews in Urfa and
Gaziantep. Sorry to interrupt. Also 1 minute left.
Okay, yeah, I mean the very last two, the slides. The main problems, as I underlined in the quotations, lack of adequate staff and education. In the second quotation, I say the Turkish NGOs, but the Syrian NGOs are taking role, and we should support them because they are from community. They are more trusted, and they know the needs of the refugee groups. And their programs are making a lot of sense. They, in this case, is important. And the main coordination problems are the coordination failures, lack of adequate service making. There is this problem that who is making what, and actor hierarchies in a meaning that the state agencies are taking and want to take a leading role, sometimes in a way to not trust other organizations. And we see that, some problems in effective solution mechanisms. I'm concluding, Ayşegül. And in general, we see as this group is very, the vulnerable group. We see a higher range of protection challenges and the vulnerabilities. And all the international norms are here, national legislation are here. But when you see to the implementation, there are these unfortunate gaps and intervened problems and short-term but inadequate interventions. They are valuable, but still they're short-term and coupled by the coordination failures. And my suggestion is that Turkey is the need and a comprehensive integration policy for refugees, because it's clear that we will live with Syrian refugees. Is the case from all over the world. That so Turkey needs to the kind of in a very clear-cut integration policy to facilitate social cohesion in the long run. Yeah, thank you for your patience.
Thank you for this nice presentation. I think we had learned a lot about the situation of Syrian children, and I particularly write down actually two issues, like the situation of unaccompanied minors and also situation of disabled children. This, particularly the latter one was also what I face up in my field research, because yes, education is free in Turkey, but unfortunately private schools for those disabled children are not free for Syrians under temporary protection in Turkey. And those children are basically living their lives only in their houses without having also enough access to medical services and devices, as you said. So we have many questions for all of you, by the way. So let me start with Meltem Hoca. If you want, so let's go in the same order of presentation when I ask questions. So Meltem Hoca, I will be summarizing our questions into two. The first question is about comparison of the 4+4+4 reform with the 1997 reform. So one asked, why does the last schooling reform was not effective on child labor compared to 1997 reform? And can you also mention about the role of mothers, how their education has been affected by these reforms? One audience asks.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. And thank you very much for the presentations. I really enjoyed the presentations of Başak Hoca and Zeynep Hoca. Thank you very much. I've learned a lot. In terms of the comparison of the two reforms, obviously they are targeting two different age groups. So one of the 97 reform was targeting smaller children, and the cost reduction in schooling was immense. So we would expect a bigger response, and this is what we actually observe. The latest reform, the 2012 reform, on the other hand, is obviously targeting older children, and therefore the costs are, there's obviously a higher opportunity cost for older children, and therefore you need a bigger reduction in schooling costs to convince these children to go back to school. But one other important distinction that I think is very important is in relation to open education. The 2012 reform allows children to be enrolled in school, but in distant learning. So you don't physically need to be in school. You can actually follow your course through distance learning. And this allows, obviously, children to work. So part of the reason, I think, is to do with the differences in the characters of the two reforms. And that we are paying more attention to see whether this is an important factor or not. So our research is still ongoing on this, but this is my feeling that that kind of allowance that physically you don't need to be at school allows you to actually combine school and work. And in fact, this is what we actually see in the numbers as well. We see that the joint time use of children in terms of going to school and working is also increasing. The second question is extremely important, and thank you very much for it. So mother's education is also increasing because of the law, obviously. We haven't done that much work on this because the children are still small. So you need to be subjected to the 97 reform, and your kids, we're expecting, in fact, a positive response rate, and that will allow us to actually see intergenerational effects of these reforms. So the reform not only affects concurrently the generation that is supposed to affect, but also hopefully the future generation through the education of their parents. So we are thinking of doing this type of work as well, but we haven't done it yet. So I can't give you any numbers in terms of what the effect was on the future generation, but extremely important. And there's lots of work that needs to be done in these areas. So I invite those who are interested to work in this area. It's very fruitful. Thank you very much.
Okay, Hocam, there's one more question for you. I will be reading the question. So the question says, why not you didn't mention about the quality of education between different income groups, or between rural versus urban areas, or at least why you didn't consider it as a challenge? I think they're just, the person is trying to compare your statement about the investment in education in terms of quantities.
Yeah, excellent question. The thing is, obviously, we don't see the quality of schooling. All we see is basically different regions and where these children go to school. So that obviously there are quality differences, as the other speakers have also pointed out, where you are, where you go to school, and the public schools change in terms of the quality. So the access to school has improved. I mean, that's for sure. It doesn't matter what type of data you look at, whether you look at the child labor force surveys, where you get household labor force surveys, whether you are looking at demographic health surveys of Hacettepe University, you see this improvement. In terms of quality, we don't have the data for that, and therefore that's the reason why I did not look at it. Not that it's not important, it's extremely important, obviously, because it's going to determine your productivity and the jobs that you will be getting in the labor market, and we know that labor market outcomes are extremely important in determining household income and the risk of poverty. And therefore, I'm not I don't want to de-emphasize it. No, to the contrary, it's extremely important. I recognize its importance, but we don't simply have the data because we're working with very large data sets, and these they don't include the quality elements of schooling. Not that that's not important; it's extremely important, but you need a different type of research to understand that.
Yeah, great, thank you. Now, my questions, the questions for our audience to Başak Hoca. The first question is about education. They ask, why does compulsory schooling reforms doesn't keep those Roma children in schools? So what's happening there? I think this is the first question. And then the second question is, how does COVID-19 and technological developments affect Roma children's well-being?
Okay. Unlike Meltem Hoca, I work with qualitative data, so our interpretations mostly depend on our interviews with teachers, with children, with their families, and trying to understand the deprivation in these schools. Once with Ayşen Candaş from Boğaziçi University Political Science Department, we have done a survey, not a survey, we have done a work on school lunch programs, and we try to create a map of schools situated in Istanbul according to some criteria that we look into, actually, which schools are that we compared that those schools with the income level of the provincial levels that we worked with a research firm. So the criteria that we look into are the teachers' points, for instance, like the teachers are receiving these points from the Ministry of Education, and they, depending on those points, they choose these schools that they want to go, and many of the teachers see the schools in these deprived neighborhoods as how you say, exile schools. So they want to spend in their early years, they spent the time in those schools, and they want to move to those schools with better conditions. So we try to come up with these different criteria, but of course we don't have, as Meltem Hoca said, enough data to evaluate it. But what we see, again, depending on the accounts of the Roma communities that we work with, the reason, as I said, there are several reasons that weakens the ties of Roma children with school. It's not a matter of having access to school on paper, but whether they can have breakfast at home, whether they need to contribute to family budget, whether they are excluded, discriminated at school. So these several factors come together and actually affect their ties with school. So I think qualitative data provides that evidence showing how they build their relations with school on the ground, and these factors define it. COVID-19 well-being of children. The COVID-19, of course, pushed all children to have access to school from home. So, of course, it depends on the technological availabilities and the ability to follow online either courses on EBA or online courses if you have access, like mostly private schools have those courses. Some public schools are trying to have these courses with the children, but majority of the children have access to the courses through EBA. So in that respect, again, as I said, several factors come together and define these gaps among children in terms of access to education. So, once you consider educational gain as an aspect of well-being, these children's well-being are deteriorating in that respect, because that we can point to some serious educational losses, and like many teachers, actually the accounts of teachers demonstrate this picture, that who could follow their students as well. And we have done a recent qualitative work on child well-being during COVID-19. What we see also is that these differences, socioeconomic differences, where children reside, these special segregations, as well as gender, are quite important in determining children well-being during the COVID-19. For instance, gender aspect emerges as a very important aspect, because many of the girls that we have talked to, they are pointed to the increase of the household chores. They have to take care of their siblings. Everybody is at home, so they cannot follow their courses on EBA. So you see these different aspects of children well-being are deteriorating. And for instance, the carer position of these young girls at home becomes a risk factor for them for their educational losses or education gains once you have access to education from home.
Perfect.
So
thank you so much. Then actually we are already time up, but we have a couple of questions I would like to ask Zeynep Hoca, but I want a very short answer if possible. Then there are two questions from Jonathan Gray, but I think these are like really general questions, so I will ask those all of you. If you have an answer, you might provide. So Zeynep Hocam, the question is, how COVID-19 might have affected the child protection for the Syrian girls and boys?
Yeah, I believe it impacted in a negative way, as we see in the other, the domestic violence cases, being at home all the time, and also to, the increasing financial burden over the families, make kind of, the hostile, let's say, the tension inside the houses, and this is one dimension. And also my very recent field work again in Şanlıurfa showed me that the Syrian population become more, let's say, they were suffering from poverty, but this extreme poverty became worse and worse with the COVID. And many Syrians who are working in the informal sector, like the car washing or textile, they lost their jobs. And this brought in a huge protection challenges, including to the kind of an obliged return of some families to Syria back, because they were saying that in our interviews, very recent interviews, just the last month, they were saying that they are not able to even pay their rents or the bills. And life conditions in Syria is better in terms of financially, at least that they will not pay any rent and bills. And I think this is bringing an additional challenges, not only the host communities, but also to the migrant refugee communities.
Perfect, thank you. So as I said, there are two general questions. The first question says, are there any figures on Syrian children working legally, particularly for 15 to 17 years old? As far as I know, there's no legal data on that. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, only data is available about the number of the Syrians who are accessing the working permits.
Yeah,
but
that's
we
all.
know that the number of the working permits are very, very low. Kind of
around 50,000 something.
Yeah, around 50,000 something, and I believe that they don't include the younger ages. This is my also the observation, because that the working permit requires the application of the employer.
Yes.
And probably for the children workers, refugee workers, it will bring in more additional procedures in which the employers will not be that happy to go.
Yeah, and in the study that we have, I have conducted with the Syrian refugees in Istanbul, strikingly, none of the Syrian children were registered. So I might say, at least from my own sample.
Yeah.
And then the question asked, a general question, I think, says, is there any information on LGBTIQ and child abuse in workplaces? I think he's asking this question for all the ethnicities, if you have any answer. And this is the last question. So, Başak Hocam, we can start from you if you have any research on it or any experience.
No. It would have been good to do such research, but also it would have been real difficult to conduct such research. But no, I don't.
Maybe I can tell Ayşegül.
Please go ahead.
My many recent work in the Denizli, which is a satellite city and hosting to the non-Syrian asylum seekers, specifically Iranians and the LGBT community. They are saying that the COVID is specifically influenced to these LGBT refugee asylum seekers communities, because the sectors like nightclubs or the service sectors, they were heavily impacted by the COVID, and these the close these sectors which the negatively influence these only let's say the only possible working sectors for the LGBTI asylum seekers.
Yeah, and in my own work, actually, I also face different child abuse examples from all three different population groups, Turkish, Roma, and Syrian. Unfortunately, this exists in different ways for different populations, but it was the case in Istanbul. And it is very much related with the employer's view and how they look at a child and how they define a child, and inspections, particularly in informal textile ateliers. For example, when I was interviewing the work conditions or the, between colleagues, how children are behaved, they were really, really detrimental for the child well-being, but they were not inspected. I think this area should be worked also a lot. Yeah, I think we had really three great presenters today, and with lots of information. I'm sure we are all tired, but before we leave, I would love to ask you to evaluate this session. Your feedbacks are very important, so we will be glad if you fill in the form just below the screen of the presentation. And tomorrow symposium will continue, as you know, afternoon at 1 p.m. So I really hope that this program, today's symposium, will at least provide some insights to all of us working or caring about children. And I'm so happy to host this session, moderate this session. Thank you again for all your great presentations and your works. I'm looking forward to read your future research. Thank you a lot for your time.
Thank you, Ayşegül.
Thank you, Ayşegül.
Thank you, Ayşegül.
Thank you, all the listeners. Have a good evening.